March 21st. Easter Sunday is how many weeks away? 2. Next week is Palm Sunday. And we are blessed to be able to come together face to face this Easter. We don't take that for granted. This is a blessing. It's a privilege to be here today, and it's a joy to see people together. But we are here to remember, and I won't say celebrate Easter, because the first Easter was not celebrated. It was a time of fear, a time of terror, and we're simply here today to remember Easter and to remember what it means to each one of us. I'm glad to see you two guys here today. I haven't seen you guys in a while. Steve's boys. Yeah, it's just nice to see people. I don't know how else to say it. Maybe that's all I need to say. It's just really nice to see all of you here. So for this morning, I'm going to call Gary up to do the call to worship. If you have anything for community time, just jot it down, give it to Gary. He'll do that a little bit later. And after the call to worship, or maybe even now while Gary's doing that, the music folks come on up, and we're going to sing together. We all know the protocols. I don't need to remind people, but let's just do this right. Gary.
Good morning, everyone. Our call to worship today is a reading from Matthew 16, 24 through 25. Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it."
Everybody, and welcome to Friends Church this morning. As we approach Easter, so these are, ironically, they're fairly new songs that we've all sang in church before, but maybe not for a while, especially not with the shutdown. But they're all Easter songs, all preparing us for the amazing thing that Jesus is, well, we're remembering that Jesus did 2,000 years ago. So let's sing together. This first song is called "Is He Worthy?" If you'd like to stay seated, go ahead, and then I'll ask you to stand with us for the second song. Check. Nothing? Test. I can hear myself in these front monitors. Nothing through the mains. Check. 1, 2.
Do you know that all the dark won't stop the light from getting through? We do. Do you wish that we could see it all made new? We do. Is all creation groaning? It is. Is a new creation coming? It is the glory of the Lord to be the light within our midst. It is it good that we remind ourselves of this? It is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave. He is David's root and the Lamb who died. and honor and glory. Is he worthy of this? He is.
Father, truly love us.
He does.
Is the Spirit move among us?
He does.
Is Jesus our Messiah? Forever those he loves.
He does. Does our God intend to dwell again with us? He does. Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave. He is David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slave from every people and tribe, every nation and tongue. He has made us a kingdom and priests to God, to reign with the Son. Is he worthy? Is he worthy of all blessing and honor and glory? Is he worthy? Is he worthy? Is he worthy of this? He is. He is. Is he worthy? Is he worthy? He is.
Thank you, everybody. In the youth last night, we were talking about patience. We're studying the book of James, and we're almost done. We've spent the last 11 weeks, most of it being online, but the last 2 weeks we've been in person. And we're in James chapter 5, and we're studying on patience and how the early Christians at the time, they were expecting the second coming, and they were wanting it to happen right away. And they were being persecuted, which kind of made being life on earth even less exciting. It has very little to do, but we can liken it to some of the suffering, some of the trials that this last season has been through, some of the, I don't know whether you want to call it the rights, it feels restrictive, some of the things that we have to do these days. But imagine how Jesus felt, who, being very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to grasp, but made himself human, someone who was very nature a deistic God who just confined himself into the very limited human form of being a human, and how confining and limiting that must have felt. And not only just to be confined in such a human form, but to have to suffer and die in such a humiliating way. Let's stand for this song. It's called Lead Me to the Cross.
Savior, I come, quiet my soul. Remember where your love poured out. Bring me to my knees, Lord, I lay me down. Rid me of myself, I belong to you. Oh, lead me. Lead me to the cross, to your heart, to your heart. Lead me to your heart. Lead me to your heart. Lead me to the cross where your love poured out. Bring me to my knees, Lord, I lay me down. Rid me of myself, I belong to you. Oh, lead me. Lead me to the cross.
Very good, thank you. You can be seated.
Down. Our series right now for Easter is about relationships. It's about different relationships that in the walk of Jesus into Easter, people that walked with him in different ways. The series, just to remind folks, I talked about it last week, the series after Easter is going to be called The Future Is Now. Is that better? Okay. The future is now. And when you think about Easter, that was the whole message of Easter. The Messiah wasn't down the road. The future is right now. And after Easter, the series that we're going to be doing is about that. It's now. And so I'm going to be asking people a question as we go forward, and I'll get that information out to you. What do you want the church to be right now? And not necessarily just Friends Church, but the church in general. What do you want the church to be right now? And there's no age limit, there's no education requirement. It's in your heart, where you're coming from. What do you want the church to be right now, right here? Because that's a question Jesus had for the disciples immediately after he came back to life. You're the church. What should it be right now? So part of the question is, what do I want it to be? And that can be a wildly diverse thing. Some of us want it to be this, some of us want it to be that. And then the second question is, what do I bring? What gift do I bring to the church? And when I say gift, you start thinking about, well, music and the rest of it. No, I'm going to suggest quite strongly that the primary gift each one of us brings to the church is a gift of brokenness and the gift of being hurt. Because unless we're broken, unless we've been hurt, we do not understand grace. And when we don't understand grace, we get long on doctrine and short on grace, to quote my father-in-law. Right? We get long on doctrine and short on grace when we forget that we have been hurt, we're hurt, but even more than that, we're broken, and it's our responsibility, at least part of it, about why we're broken. So we're going to be moving into that in after Easter, excuse me. But for today, I want to talk about a fourth relationship in the story to Easter. We've talked about three. One was an intellect, an expert in the religious law. If I think about that kind of person today, I think maybe a TV evangelist that tells us what to do and not to do, who tells us about politics and where we should be going. That kind of, because in the world of Jesus, that's what the religious leaders did. They told people what to do politically as much as spiritually, right? If I think about that in my own life, I had a hero, a great uncle named Uncle Jake. Jake Lowen was his name. And he was a Bible translator. He was the first Mennonite brethren to get a doctorate in anthropology way back in the 50s, and he had a big ego. And I just loved this guy, right? He had a huge ego. He liked to be the expert, and he liked to win debates. And he liked to be very noticed. If he'd get up in church, you know, he wasn't big, but it felt like he was about 5 feet wide and 10 feet tall when he started talking. He just had that kind of presence. Towards the end of his life, he had a stroke. And he wrote a book after that called Educating Tiger. It's about mistakes he felt he'd made in educating his son and how he'd handle church stuff. And he said as follows: I've realized that I have a very sharp tongue. Time and again, I've cut people down with razor-sharp slashes of my own verbal sword. Bridling my tongue, as James says, coming back to the book of James, is still a major area of unfinished business in my life. So when I think of Nicodemus, I'm thinking of a major church leader, and I think in my life of a major church leader, and I see the humility that he showed at the end of his life, saying, I've got work to do still. And how do you bridle a tongue that's partially paralyzed by a stroke? A mind that's partially damaged by a stroke. These are some realities there. A second relationship. Somebody respected by very few. A woman married 5 times. Living with a man she wasn't married to. Not somebody you'd associate with. Not good company. I think of this story about a man, told to me about a man in the South America, in the Mennonite colonies in the Chaco, who, and wasn't a Spanish man, we're talking a Mennonite Paraguayan, right? So speaking German, from German background, and he was an alcoholic, and he came to Christ. He got born again. And a few months later, somebody found him roaring drunk in the middle of town, right? And so one of the church folks came to the pastor and said, we need discipline here. This can't go. It's a bad example. And the pastor said, you know, being born again isn't just a one-time thing. It's a lifetime thing. Being born again hasn't reached his stomach. When it reaches his stomach, he'll start throwing up when he has too much to drink. So we're going to walk alongside him till he gets there. In other words, it's a lifetime journey, right? And that's what happened with this man. But he went pretty much the rest of his life with a problem with alcohol. Do we associate with folks like this, men or women with a lifetime problem? Do we do that? Or do we say, I don't want you as a part of my family. I'll invite you for a lunch, but I don't want my kids around you, right? Jesus dealt with that, people who were discriminated against. The woman in this case also experienced a lot of racial discrimination. She was a Samaritan. If we think about that kind of woman, where would we see her today? We'd see her probably at a Black Lives Matter rally or Asian Lives Matter rally. That's where we might see someone like that. Is there a culture that we think drinks more than others? How many of us go to downtown Winnipeg and go and say, you know, those First Nation folks, they're the ones, they drink a lot more than I do. So you can see how it wasn't just in that culture, it's in our culture, how we start dealing with some of these things. And a third person was one of those who's just one of us. If we saw her, we'd say, yeah, she just looks like us, she acts like us, but she was contagious because of an illness, but it wasn't an illness that you could catch by touching. It was a religious contagion that people didn't want to see. Who are those followers of Jesus that we see as contagious? They believe a little differently than we do. They have a different perspective on some church issues than we do. A major church in Steinbach now is going through a split because Jesus followers aren't agreeing on what happens to us when we die. Do we just die, or do we go to eternal hell? And I'm not making a theological statement. I'm saying, how do we operate in love and caring when people who are Jesus followers are struggling with the idea that, would God actually send somebody to hell? Okay, that's the struggle. And I'm not talking about that theological position today. I'm simply saying, do we now separate and divide? Or do we say we are trying to work together in the best interests of the message of Jesus Christ? And so that's part of all these relationships that we've talked about so far. And I want to introduce another one, but I want to start with this. All of the people I've talked about so far were united in one thing. They were united in fear. They were scared of something, loss of reputation, of being considered less than, racism. You can go down the list, the same list we have today. Ecclesiastes says there's not much new under the sun, and there's truth to that. What we see in the Bible happens today. And I'm not trying to lay heavy on folks, but I'm saying Easter is not lighthearted. I mean, we can talk about the Easter bunny and that's people's way of trying to make things a little less heavy. And I love chocolate at Easter. I shouldn't, but I do, right? So I enjoy part of that too. But the real message of Easter is a heaviness about somebody dying and dying under torture. That's the reality of what Easter is. And these relationships that I'm speaking about speak into that reality. But in that reality, how do we deal with fear? 1 John 4, and I've given more verses than what I have up here. You can look at it. But it says, in a nutshell, there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. So in the relationship with everybody I've talked to, what did Jesus do? Did he show this or did he show this? Did he show this or did he show that? He took care of the fear they had so that they could have a conversation, so they could have a relationship. And Jesus did this, right? He did this right through the cross. He did this and showed his hands punctured by nails. It was like this. So I want to talk about another one today. It's a disciple, Peter. Peter is one of those people that is kind of hard to stomach sometimes. If he'd be your friend, he'd be the one that always would be in front. He would be noticed. He would do everything first. And if you were supposed to be first in line, he'd probably jump in the way because he had to be the first in line. So a few things about Peter. Matthew 16:18, Jesus called him. Didn't matter what his personality was. Jesus called him. You're Peter, and on this rock, which is Simon Peter, I will build my church. Jesus called Peter. Even though Peter would be somebody that we might not feel really comfortable with. Peter was, and at one point Jesus wasn't either. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." If you're not sure about that reference, Google it and read that story, right? So Jesus was pretty hard on Peter, but he knew Peter had some gifts. And the gift that he brought to the church, well, hold on a minute, we're going to get to that. And Peter followed. Two things. He's called and he followed. And that's the basis of being called a Christian. We're called, Jesus calls each one of us, and we choose to follow. So if you choose to follow, I hope you don't feel like you have to be a Christian like me, or I have to be a Christian like you. I am simply who I am. Jesus calls me, and I follow. And the rest kind of happens after we go. Jesus molds us, but I'm sure glad we're not all computer chips that look the same and talk the same and act the same. Right? What a boring church that would be. Now, we get in conflict at times because we're not computer chips, right? Sometimes that happens, but I'd much rather have conflict than complacency. I'd much rather have people with strong opinions and strong ideas than people that, you know what, it's just Sunday morning, it doesn't matter, we've got the rest of the week. Which kind of church, which kind of Christian do we want to be or be a part of? So Peter followed. If you visited a farm with animals, what does it smell like? Go to the barn. What's it going to smell like? Manure, right? And old hay. Depends how quickly you clean out the horse trough, Steve. I don't know. But you know there's going to be a smell, right? That's a farm. And if you go to a grain bin, what's the bottom of that bin going to smell like after a while? Isn't that kind of real life? So think about that image and think about Peter. Peter was like that, but with fish. He was a fisherman. He smelled of fish. His hands were calloused from hauling nets. I would watch Inuit fishermen go halibut fishing with nets in the cold, and they would come back and their hands would be scarred and bloody. But after a while, they wouldn't be because they'd have the calluses on their hands from hauling up nets. Peter would have had those kind of calluses. That's what he did. There wasn't an automatic winch. There wasn't a motor. He did that way. And he probably had shoulders to be proud of, right? He had to use all of that. His clothing probably smelled of the fish he caught. and his face was lined with the weathering of Lake Galilee, which was well known for a lot of storms. Luke tells us one morning, and this is Luke chapter 5, Jesus was speaking to a crowd, and to get a bit of space, he asked a fisherman to take him a bit offshore. And when they were there, he told the fishermen to let down his nets, and they had caught nothing all night. They took the nets and they let it down the other way. They had already been cleaning the nets, so this was a lot of extra work. And they caught a whole net full of fish on the other side. And Peter, called Simon, recognized power, and he was frightened. And Jesus spoke to him, and he said, "Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you're going to fish for people." So they pulled their boat up on shore. They left everything. And what did they do? Peter followed him. He left his business behind for somebody to handle. Is that something we would do? To say, I'm going to leave my business, everything I have, and I'm just going to go walk between Morden and Winkler and Elm Creek and Carmen and Rose Isle, and with Jesus, I'm just going to walk those roads. Or I'm going to get an old van and just hang out with them, and we're just going to go back and forth talking to people about who Jesus is. That's the equivalent of what we're talking about. He gave up everything, impetuous, right? Felt it, and he just did it. He had to be first. Peter was a risk taker. No one else would try to walk on water. Peter did. And it was just after feeding to the 5,000, Peter was out in a boat with the other disciples, and it was bad weather. And in the morning, they hadn't made it very far, and all of a sudden they see Jesus walking on water. And that particular miracle, I need to say that in some of my seminary work, I had a professor who said, it might have been there was a sandbar under there and he was walking on a sandbar. Anybody here believe that? I hope not. This was a flat-out miracle of Jesus. He was walking on water. How do we know that's not true? Well, who jumped out of the boat first to try it? It was Peter, right? And what happened to Peter? If there was a sandbar, why did he start drowning? So you look at the Bible proves itself if we just let the story happen. And so Peter saw Jesus and he kind of said, "Let me walk on water too." And Jesus, in his own words, says, "Well, come on then." And what happened when Peter failed? Jesus rescued him. But Peter took the risk. Was Peter a coward? Think about it, was he? We consider him a coward. If you want to be honest about it, we do, and we're going to get to that story in a minute. Peter was a leader. And so when Jesus was arrested, what did he do? He took a weapon, he took a sword, and today we'd probably take a gun, right? It's an equivalent. And he slashed off the ear of somebody. It wasn't even one of those arresting Jesus, it was a slave who came along to help out. That was it. And Jesus told him to put away his sword. But Peter had taken the sword out. There's courage in that. There's no cowardice in what he did. There were two that followed Jesus when he was arrested, two of them. Peter was one of them. And he tried to walk on water, so he did lead. But Peter was fearful of something. He was fearful of one thing above all else. And that fear caught up with him. In the early morning, people said, "Weren't you one of those people with Jesus?" And what did he say? No. Right? Not me. What caught up with him? Peter was scared to die. Peter was scared of death. And being a pastor, and I'm sure Dale and others who've dealt with older folks who are dying, you know that it comes to the point where people say, "I know death is on the other side, but I'm scared of how I die." There's always a fear of death in all of us. We want to be alive for the most part. Even people that have told me they want to take their lives have had a fear of death. Even some of those who have taken their lives later have talked about that fear of death. Easter is about conquering the fear of death. It's not lighthearted at all. It's conquering the fear of death. And Peter was part of the Easter story, but the Easter story was not done. Do you remember the story that we talked earlier about Peter being the fisherman in the boat, letting the net down on the other side? Well, Jesus is brilliant. He said, I'm going to rescue Peter. I'm going to bring him back. So Peter had been broken, right? And he knew he was one of the first that went to the tomb, although he was outrun by the other disciple, and women were the first. But he was one of the first men that got there. And now Peter didn't know what to do. It was no longer the fear of death that was his issue. It was the fear of, I have betrayed my best friend. I've been a coward. I'm not a real man. Right? Because we have stereotypes of men, and cowardice is not one of those things that men are supposed to experience. I think every man here can talk to a time when we have experienced that, where we've backed off, where our fear has stopped us from getting there. If we can't admit to that, we probably are not fully a part of the Easter story. Right? We admit to our brokenness. So Peter was taken back there, and they were out fishing again, and they saw a man on the shore. Think about the early morning mist. This is a kind of fishing boat we'd probably use, just a single engine on the back, not big, a lake. On the shoreline, this could be a Manitoba shoreline, right? Just think about it in our own terms, not the Sea of Galilee. I think I've seen you folks have a boat like this, am I right? Albert and Sandy. So you just think about that, and they're off, and this person says, throw the net on the other side. That story sound familiar? And they caught fish, lots of them. And then John, they don't say his name, but it sounds like it was John, said, hey, that's Jesus. And Peter, what does he do? He doesn't wait to walk on water. He swims. He gets to the shore. And now he's with Jesus, but what do? He's betrayed Jesus. He's not worthy to be a leader, yet his gifts are leading. Where does Peter go with this? Can you imagine the emotions when eating a bit of bread and the fish? Jesus says to him, do you love me? And then, do you love me again? And a third time, do you love me? Put yourself in Peter's robe, because he was probably barefoot. So don't try his shoes at that point. He was on a beach. Sit where Peter's sitting and think about being asked that question by Jesus, do you love me? And Peter, think of his emotion, he says, I do. I do. You know I do, which is a plea. Don't you know that I do? And what does Jesus do? He takes this broken man and he says, my grace is sufficient for you. Feed my sheep. Lead my church. Peter didn't come to that point of leadership strictly because of the gifts he had. He came because he was broken and Jesus put him back together. Now, Peter's a bit of an enigma for me. I'll just close with this. I connect more with John. I like John. I see Peter as too brash and too out there, and he has the answers for everything. And yet there's something terribly lovable about him. He fails all the time. He doesn't think before he acts. He just jumps in. In many ways, Peter's like a child who needs a mom or dad around to protect them if they skin their knee, just to clean up that knee, or if they crawl up a tree they're not supposed to be, to get them down, and doesn't spank them at that point, but just loves them. Like he's that kind of child getting in trouble. But when Peter had to face his greatest fear and he failed, it helped him grow up. And that's what fear does to us. It helps us grow up in our faith. It was at the moment that he started to grow up that Jesus commissioned him to be the leader of the church. It wasn't because he was strong and the rest of it, because he was broken. And then the gifts that Jesus had given him could get used. And Peter did grow up. He matured. He made lots of mistakes still in his life. He and Paul had battles about who should be in communion and how that happened. But he had conquered his fear of death. And he did that knowing that Jesus had given him a job in the kingdom. Peter still could get scared, but it no longer paralyzed him. And that's the thing, right? I'm still scared of how I'm going to eventually die. I'm hoping Jesus comes before that happens. right? I'm not looking forward to that. But it doesn't paralyze me anymore because there's a personal relationship with Jesus Christ that's going to continue past that door of death. But when I'm there, when people are dying, when my father was dying, I recognized that I had wanted nothing to do with being where my father was, if that was me. I don't want to be somebody who has dementia, who's there, doesn't know what they're doing. Except that somebody told me once, don't you think he's closer to God than you are? Now, there was a comforting thought. Now the fear of death is a little bit different. Peter had to face that. Peter's simply one of those examples at Easter. Each one of us here is created in the image of God. We're each sinners, and if we choose, we're saved by grace. We can choose not to, but we can choose to be saved by grace. And when we accept that, we start a lifetime of growing up. We become a Christian, but that's a lifetime of conversion. Being born again is one part of it. It's a beginning, and then it's like the whole life that we go through. We're taught by Jesus if we let him teach us, and we're led by the Spirit if we open our hearts to that. When we accept that grace, we become missionaries just by the simple fact of following. Each one of us here is called by God to be a missionary. Each one, there's no exception. It's just a question of what we do with that and what gifts God wants us to use. None of us fit a stereotype. We just follow. We're called and we follow. Truth is, what we have is more than enough if we let God's grace work with it. Following. The choice of Easter. Simply to follow Christ to the cross, to the resurrection, and then the next step. That's the choice of Easter. And what a wonderful, wonderful thing. I'm looking forward to 2 weeks from now when we celebrate the risen Christ. But I want to celebrate that risen Christ because I have paid attention to the price he paid getting there and how my brokenness gets us to that point. May the Lord be with you.
Thank you for that, Terry. The takeaway in my mind, the most valuable thing you can bring to church is your brokenness. Who would have thunk, hey? Who would have thunk? This closing verse, or song we're going to sing is called Revelation Song. It's our response, of course, given by its title. It's an excerpt from Revelation about all the angels saying, "Worthy is the Lamb who can open the scroll."
Sing a new song to him who sits on heaven's mercy seat. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Clothed in rainbows, a living color, flashes of lightning, rolls of thunder. Blessing and honor, strength and glory and power be to you, the only wise King. And holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You everything, and I will adore you. Yes, Lord, I will adore you. Filled with wonder, awesome wonder, at the mention of your name. Jesus, your name is power, breath of living water, such a marvelous mystery. Yeah, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was, is, and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was, is, and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you.
I just simply say to you, the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
And I really mean that. The Lord be with you this week. Go in peace.